What if the next major global crisis didn't begin with a massive explosion, but with silence? A frozen screen, banking transactions slowing down, communications disappearing, ships stuck at sea, markets panicking? Because right now, behind the headlines about missiles and aircraft carriers, another reality is deeply worrying Western military planners: the extreme vulnerability of global infrastructure in the event of rising tensions with Iran. For several weeks now, tensions in the Middle East have been escalating sharply. Washington is reinforcing its military presence in the region. American aircraft carriers are being deployed near sensitive areas. Western allies are monitoring strategic maritime routes. And on the Iranian side, the rhetoric is becoming increasingly aggressive. Tehran keeps repeating the same message: if Iran is attacked or economically strangled, the consequences will go far beyond the Middle East. And what truly worries analysts is not just the possibility of a conventional war, it's the possibility of a hybrid conflict, a confrontation where the objective would not necessarily be to defeat the United States militarily, but to disrupt the entire global system. Because today, the modern world depends on extremely fragile infrastructure: a few maritime choke points, a few trade routes, a few undersea cables, a few energy platforms. Sometimes a single breaking point is enough to trigger a worldwide chain reaction, and Iran understands this perfectly. For years, Tehran has studied how major powers conduct war. Iran knows it cannot compete head-on with American military power, but it can make a conflict unbearably costly. That is the core of Iran's strategy: avoid direct confrontation while targeting the sensitive arteries of the global economy: oil, maritime trade, digital infrastructure, communications, supply chains. And that is exactly why the current tensions are causing so much concern. Because this is no longer just about a regional conflict between Iran and its rivals. We are talking about a risk capable of disrupting the internet, energy markets, financial systems, and international trade within hours. And at the center of these fears lies a reality that very few people actually see. Beneath the oceans, often near geopolitical flashpoints, run the true arteries of the modern world: massive, nearly invisible cables carrying the overwhelming majority of global data traffic. And today, several governments fear that if tensions escalate further, those infrastructures could become primary targets. For decades, an American aircraft carrier was almost a psychological weapon. Whenever one of these giants appeared off the coast of a country, the message was simple: the United States can strike whenever it wants, wherever it wants. These ships are enormous. Some carry more than 70 fighter jets. They have their own defense systems, escort destroyers, submarines, and radar capabilities. For decades, they symbolized absolute American military dominance at sea. But today, something is changing. Because against powers like Iran, the question is no longer simply who has the biggest military. The real question is becoming who can make war unbearably expensive. And that is exactly what Tehran has been working on for years. Iran knows perfectly well that it cannot defeat the US Navy in a conventional naval war. That would be impossible. So Iranian strategists developed a different doctrine: saturate, harass, complicate, exhaust. Instead of direct confrontation, the objective is to create multiple simultaneous threats: ballistic missiles capable of targeting military bases, explosive drones launched in swarms, anti-ship missiles hidden along the coastline, naval mines that are difficult to detect, fast attack boats capable of surrounding larger ships. And above all, Iran possesses an enormous geographical advantage because there is one location that literally terrifies global markets: the Strait of Hormuz. On a map, it almost looks insignificant: a narrow strip of water squeezed between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. But in reality, it is one of the most strategic choke points on Earth. A massive share of the world's oil supply passes through this corridor. Every day, dozens of oil tankers move through these waters. And the problem is that in the event of a major conflict, this area could become extremely dangerous. Even without completely shutting down the strait, Iran could still trigger global panic. A few targeted attacks, a few damaged ships, a few explosions, and immediately oil prices could skyrocket. Maritime insurance costs would explode. Markets would panic. Supply chains would slow down. Because global trade depends on one essential factor: stability. And in this region, that stability is becoming increasingly fragile. But what worries military planners even more is this: despite all its power, a modern aircraft carrier remains an enormous target. And today, new technologies are making protection far more difficult. Some drones cost only a few $1,000s. Modern anti-ship missiles are becoming faster and more precise. Certain attacks can now come from multiple directions simultaneously, and the objective is not even necessarily to sink an aircraft carrier. Sometimes simply damaging it is enough, forcing it to withdraw, disrupting its operations. Because a single major incident involving an American warship would create a massive political and media shockwave across the world. And that is exactly why the current situation is so tense. The more the United States demonstrates military power in the region, the more Iran tries to prove that no power is truly untouchable. In other words, the battle is no longer only about brute force. It is about creating doubt. Doubt about the security of maritime routes, doubt about the protection of infrastructure, doubt about the ability of major powers to fully control the situation. And in a hyper-connected world, entirely dependent on maritime trade, that doubt itself becomes a weapon. When people think about modern warfare, they usually imagine fighter jets, missiles, explosions, satellite imagery. But today, a huge part of global power depends on something far less spectacular: cables. Massive cables lying on the ocean floor, sometimes thousands of meters deep. And yet, these cables are what keep the modern world running. Almost everything depends on them: internet traffic, international calls, banking transactions, financial markets, military communications, cloud services, digital platforms, social media. Every message sent, every video streamed, every bank transfer, all of it passes through these underwater lines. And what's remarkable is how few people realize just how vulnerable this system actually is. Because in reality, these cables are incredibly difficult to protect. They stretch across thousands of kilometers of ocean. They pass near strategic shipping lanes. They often run through regions exposed to geopolitical tensions. And in some areas, only a handful of cables connect entire continents. In other words, the global system is far more fragile than it appears. For years now, major powers have been watching this issue with growing concern. Why? Because a targeted act of sabotage could create massive disruption without firing a single missile at a city. Imagine this for a moment. Not a total global internet blackout. It's not that simple. But widespread slowdowns, communications cut between certain regions, financial markets disrupted, banks struggling to synchronize critical data, digital platforms overwhelmed, businesses paralyzed, and above all, widespread confusion. Because in this kind of hybrid warfare, the hardest part is often identifying who is truly responsible. A cable can be damaged accidentally by a ship anchor, an underwater earthquake, or a technical failure. But in a highly explosive geopolitical climate, every incident becomes suspicious. And that is exactly what worries Western governments today. Because in the event of escalation with Iran, the risk goes far beyond military bases or naval vessels. Global digital infrastructure itself could become part of the battlefield, especially since Tehran has spent years observing the new forms of warfare emerging around the world. Cyber attacks, indirect sabotage, economic pressure, destabilization of critical networks. The objective is not always to destroy a country completely. Sometimes the goal is simply to create enough chaos to force political pressure. And the problem is that modern societies are entirely dependent on interconnected systems. Everything is connected: energy, communications, banking, maritime transport, digital platforms, supply chains. When one part of the system slows down, the consequences can spread incredibly fast. That is exactly what major powers have realized in recent years. In the modern world, infrastructure itself has become a strategic weapon. And as tensions surrounding Iran continue to rise, that fear is quietly growing inside Western military and political circles. The fear of a war that would not only target armies, but the everyday functioning of the entire world. For a long time, many Western capitals viewed Iran as a limited regional power. A sanctioned country, economically weakened, capable of creating tensions, but incapable of truly shaking the global balance. But over the years, that perception began to change because Iran gradually built a far more sophisticated strategy than simple conventional military power. Tehran understood one essential reality. In the modern world, you do not need to be the strongest superpower to become a major strategic threat. You only need the ability to disrupt the balance. And that is exactly what Iran has managed to do across several parts of the Middle East. In Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, Iranian influence expanded through allied groups capable of acting indirectly. This strategy allows Tehran to project power without officially entering a full-scale war. And for the United States and its allies, that makes the situation far more difficult to manage. Because in the event of a major escalation, the conflict could rapidly spread far beyond Iran's borders. Attacks on military bases, disruptions to maritime traffic, drone strikes, cyber attacks, pressure on global energy routes. Everything could escalate extremely quickly. And recent conflicts have only reinforced those concerns. Iranian drones, in particular, have deeply impressed military observers. For years, many underestimated these technologies. Today, that has changed. Drones have become cheaper, more precise, harder to intercept, and capable of overwhelming advanced defense systems. A sophisticated missile may cost millions of dollars. An attack drone can cost a fraction of that. And yet, it can still inflict strategic damage. This completely changes traditional military calculations because it allows less wealthy powers to threaten extremely expensive military assets. But what truly worries major powers is the combination of all these capabilities together. Iran is not relying only on missiles, not only on drones, not only on regional allies. Everything works together. It is a strategy of permanent pressure, a strategy designed to complicate every decision made by its adversaries. Because today, a conflict involving Iran could simultaneously affect several critical sectors: oil, maritime trade, digital infrastructure, financial markets, supply chains. And that is where the issue becomes global. Because the international economy still depends heavily on the Middle East, even as many countries attempt to reduce that dependence. The Gulf remains vital to global energy markets. The maritime routes crossing the region are essential for international trade. And in an already fragile global economy, a major crisis could immediately impact prices, inflation, and market stability. That is also why Iranian statements are taken so seriously. Even when some Western officials dismiss them as rhetoric, military planners and analysts continue to monitor the situation very closely because they understand that today, power is no longer measured only by the number of tanks or fighter jets. Sometimes, true power lies in the ability to disrupt a global system that has become dangerously dependent on a small number of critical infrastructures. And as tensions continue to rise, that dependence increasingly looks like a vulnerability. At its core, the message Iran is sending to the world may actually be very simple. You may attack us, but you will not control the consequences. And that is exactly what makes the current situation so dangerous. Because today, no one truly seems to want a full-scale war. The United States knows that a major conflict in the Middle East could become extremely costly, militarily, economically, and politically. Europe fears another surge in energy prices and another wave of global instability. Gulf countries fear the entire region could spiral into uncontrollable chaos. And even Iran knows that a direct confrontation with major powers could have devastating consequences for its own territory. Yet despite all this, the pressure keeps rising. And in situations like this, the real danger often comes less from deliberate decisions and more from escalation. A maritime incident, a drone shot down, a strike misinterpreted, an attack carried out by an allied militia, a miscalculation. And suddenly, the entire machine spirals out of control. That is exactly what worries many geopolitical analysts today: the risk of gradual escalation becoming impossible to stop once it begins. Because the more each side demonstrates strength, the more each side feels compelled to prove it will not back down. The United States deploys aircraft carriers to display power. Iran multiplies warnings to demonstrate its ability to retaliate. And between them, the entire world watches nervously. Because behind this confrontation lies a much deeper reality. The modern world has become dangerously dependent on invisible networks, maritime routes, energy infrastructure, satellites, undersea cables, data centers, interconnected banking systems. Everything functions continuously until one part of the system starts breaking down. And that is precisely the vulnerability Iran appears determined to highlight. Tehran knows it probably cannot militarily dominate the major Western powers, but perhaps that is no longer the objective. The objective is to prove that no superpower can fully protect every infrastructure the modern world depends on. And in a globalized economy, that idea alone can already trigger enormous consequences. Financial markets hate uncertainty. Shipping companies hate risk. Investors hate instability. In other words, even without a full-scale war, tension itself becomes a strategic weapon. And perhaps that is the biggest transformation of our era. Modern wars are no longer only about conquering territory, they are also about disrupting systems, creating fear, raising costs, paralyzing infrastructure, weakening the opponent's economy. And the more interconnected the world becomes, the more powerful this strategy becomes. Today, a conflict involving Iran could have consequences far beyond the Middle East. Higher oil prices, disrupted maritime trade, cyber attacks, financial instability, pressure on digital networks. Everything is connected. And that is why this crisis is being watched so nervously in capitals around the world. Because beyond the missiles and aircraft carriers, a new question is quietly emerging. Has the modern world become too dependent on infrastructures that can never be fully protected? And if the answer is yes, then the wars of the future may look very different from the wars humanity has known until now.